the long-term epidemic of isolation and loneliness in America. We're so happy to have Patrick Henry with us today to present for us on this very important topic. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of quick housekeeping. If I can get the slides to change. There we go. All right. So this is our NIAPers. This is our mission. Our mission is, we're a change agent that's dedicated to improving services, public policies, and social conditions for people with mental health, substance use, and trauma-related challenges. And we do that by promoting health, wellness, and recovery with full community inclusion so that everyone may achieve maximum potential in whatever community they choose. So today's webinar is being recorded, and you can find that recording along with a PDF of the PowerPoint on our website at www.nyapers.org. That's NYAPRS.org, and I'm going to put that in the chat box for you as well. We are providing CEUs for this webinar for LMSWs, LCSWs, CPRPs, and LMHCs. Now, there's some ways, some really important instructions in order for you to get your CEUs. So in order to receive those CEUs, you must be in the virtual room and not on the phone. So we ask that you not call in and join the virtual room if you would like to receive CEUs. We also ask that you return your evaluation within 48 hours of receipt. So everyone who registered for today's webinar will receive an evaluation via the email address that you use to register for today's event. This is very important. So we do this for a couple of reasons. The first reason for the evaluation is, of course, we want your feedback. We always want to try to improve our offerings to you, and we want your feedback. The second reason is without that evaluation, we are not able to provide you with any CEUs. And we do ask that you return that evaluation within 48 hours of receipt. You'll get your evaluation within 24 hours of today's webinar, probably by the end of the day. We will not be able to provide anyone who participated in the webinar with CEUs if we do not receive your evaluation before the 48-hour period. So it's really important that we get that. We just have an astronomical amount of people on our website, on our webinars rather, that are asking for CEUs, so we need to be able to say, we have to have a cutoff for them. We do ask that you keep your phones muted and your cameras turned off. You may also want to use the active speaker view. If you hover your mouse over the panel of over our faces, you'll see there's like 3, 4 thumbnails, and if you hover over the one that just looks like a box, it'll say show small active speaker video, and you can change your video settings so that you only see the person who's speaking up on the webinar. All right, also want to remind you of Mindfully NIAPers. Ruth Cologne Wagner started this back in March, I want to say. It's been wildly successful, and it's basically a 5-day mindful moment, a great way to start your work day. You can do it with your staff. You can do it, on your own. Share this with your family, friends, neighbors. Just a great way to sort of start your day, get grounded, and have a new meditation every day. And you can find that on our webpage at nyapers.org, and you'll see right on the landing page, start your workday mindfully, and just click on that. And then you can also go back, and because we have archived all of the ones that we've recorded, so you can go back and look at those as well. Another initiative that NIAPers has been involved with since the beginning of COVID is with the Coalition for Behavioral Health in New York City, and it's called the Strive for 5 campaign. It's basically about New Yorkers looking out for each other. So we ask that you might check in or identify 5 people that you want to check in with for the next 30 days and really prioritize people who live alone or in recovery or may have some anxiety around what's going on in the world around them. Think about starting a team at your agency, your circle of friends, folks that you're involved with. And if you're going to take the challenge, we do want you to email us and share what you're doing with us at strive45challenge@gmail.com. And we also ask that you use social media to promote what you're doing, that you're committed to connecting with 5 people for the next 30 days. And the hashtag for that is hashtag NYStrive5. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Harvey now, who's going to introduce our speaker. Harvey.
Thank you, Daniela. Thanks again for a great opening. So again, you heard, I'm Harvey Rosenthal, and I'm the CEO of NYAPRS, the New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services. And you heard what that long name corresponds to. And certainly, as you probably know, NYAPRS is a coalition for many years of people who provide and or receive mental health services. So we have, and including me and our staff. So we're all in recovery. We all live and breathe recovery, and that's what this is all about, these kinds of presentations. We have 4 key activities. I just want to tell you a little bit about us that way. We are an advocacy group. Right now we're working on COVID, on federal advocacy. We're trying to see that there's some money for the states and localities. We're working to look at the spread of the virus in psych centers and what can be done around that, what is happening. And we're looking to pass legislation banning solitary confinement for vulnerable people, in fact, everyone if we could. We do a lot of education and training throughout the country. You can see more on our website about that. We created the Peer Bridger model back in the mid-90s, and we've done a number of adaptations. We're passionate about peer support, and we're always looking at pilots that will extend it further here in New York and nationally. And we have our annual conference where we celebrate recovery. We don't have a date for that. For those of you who are wondering, we're going to do it virtually. It's going to be 2 half days, 1 week, and then 2 half days the following week. And we haven't picked a date. It'll be sometime in September or October. And if we're successful, and we hope to be, in raising money through sponsors and through CEU, folks who are requesting CEUs, we're hoping that for most people, it will be free. So we'll be letting you know more about that. Next week, I just want to say before I disappear, there's the final in this month's, free webinar series, Standing on the Shoulders, Stories of Our Movement. And we're so proud to have 3 real heroes of our movement going way back. So Joseph Rogers, who's the founder and executive director, National Mental Health Consumers Self-Help Clearinghouse. We have Sally Zinman, the executive director of the California Association of Mental Health Peer-Run Organizations, and Celia Brown, the regional advocacy specialist, New York State Office of Mental Health. But their work precedes these titles and their jobs in those titles. They are lifers and they're passionate, and I hope you join us next week on July 30th at noon. So speaking of heroes, Patrick Henry, I'm so glad Patrick's able to join us today. He's a dear person, and I'm happy to say he's a friend of mine, and I'm proud to say that. He really is a person that is ever present on so many levels, working on behalf of people in recovery and people who provide peer support. His title is Vice President of Peer Advocacy Supports and Services for Mental Health America. His prime mission has been to passionately support the inclusion of mental health peers in all aspects of the mental health system. He's the former director of the National Consumer Supporter TA Center, one of SAMHSA's funded national TA centers. He has led Mental Health America in the development of a national peer support certification. Prior to his work at the MHA, he worked as a mental health advocate in Florida, where he co-founded the first peer-run organization back in 1992. He's a pioneer. And he really, I met him because I was at a conference in Florida and I was there to present on self-directed care, my passion. And this man walks up to me and it turns out to be the developer of self-directed care. So I deferred to him in that presentation, as you would think I would. And he's really been my hero in that way. He really has spread the word on, sharing public funds with people themselves who are in recovery and letting them buy the real life things that they need, rather than sitting in programs talking about it. It's a phenomenal program, and Patrick has been really the leader on a national basis in that. He's also served as the Director of Consumer Affairs for the SAMHSA office in Southwest Florida. He is the recipient of the 2014 National Accountant's Eli Lilly Lifetime Award, and he was the winner of the prestigious Sam Savoyce Award as well, and the prestigious Clifford Beers Award from Mental Health America. But he's our reward because he really is a real hero, and he never stops working. As his friend, I try to get him to slow down, but he really provides so much good for people on so many levels. And you've heard political, programmatic, peer, and supportive peers. So anyway, here I'm going to put Patrick on now. He's a dear friend to me, and I'm sure he'll be one to you too. So, Patrick.
Thank you, Harvey. I appreciate it.
I'm going to disappear.
Let's see if I can get the slide to change.
No?
There we go. So this is a subject that I've really been interested in for a long time. And so I refer to it as the long-term epidemic of isolation and loneliness in America. I mean, we know that we're going through this period of social distancing and quarantining and all of that, but that's not the beginning of it. There's a growing epidemic, really worldwide, especially in developing countries. And it's been going on for decades. It's only really come to the forefront in the United States in the last couple of years. Europe's been a little bit ahead of us, but as we know, the pandemic has had some unique challenges to this very problem. We've had lockdowns, we've got social distancing, quarantines, people who want to wear masks, people who don't want to wear masks. And all of this has kind of contributed to a general sense of anxiety and depression in the country. And really that is the effect of the feelings of isolation and loneliness. So we can go back, like I say, decades and begin to see the changes taking place in society that have started to contribute to this feeling of isolation that many Americans feel. And we're going to talk about some of the statistics of it, and they're quite surprising because it isn't what we would probably think it is. Cigna did a loneliness index in 2018-19, and they've released a 2020 report. It's a survey of over 20,000 American adults. And in it, it says that over half of the people report that they are lonely sometimes or always. And one in four say they are rarely or never feel as though there are people who understand them. When you think about that, I mean, when over half of our population feels lonely some of the time or all of the time. The US population report, as I said, 61% of Americans are lonely in 2019, 61%. That's up from 54% in 2018. 52% sometimes, as I said, or always feel alone, and that's up from 46% in 2018. So all of the numbers began to take this dramatic increase the year before the pandemic started. And so what we have to do is we've got to look and see what else is going on in our society that's driving this. I mean, as we look down these numbers, we can see, 47% sometimes or always feel that their relationships are not meaningful. That's amazing. 49% feel as though they lack companionship. And so, again, what is it that's separating us from each other? Why is it that as life gets busier, people work together more closely prior to the pandemic, yet they're starting to feel like they're more separate from the people around them? Loneliness is really pervasive. It can take place everywhere in society. And it can take place everywhere in Western society. And we're also beginning to see dramatic increases in developing countries also. So there's a lot going on here below the horizon that we're not fully aware of yet. And it's going to take a lot more research. You know, you can feel lonely in a small town, you can feel lonely in a large town, you can feel lonely in a crowd. Corporate leaders state that they're lonely, and stay-at-home parents are lonely. Sometimes it hits people because they feel that there's nobody that understands them. And sometimes it's because people feel that it's easier to start a relationship with someone else who's in a similar position. So we tend to group together, and we find that people who are lonely frequently find their greatest sense of support when they seek out other people who are feeling similarly. We know this in behavioral health because it's been a major part of what we do for a long time. We know that isolation, social exclusion, loneliness, depression, and anxiety are very prevalent among people living with psychiatric diagnoses. We also know that when people join support groups or go to things like clubhouses or social centers like drop-in centers, and they're around other people with similar issues, they sometimes feel protected, and it's easier for them to kind of open up and talk about how they're really feeling. One of the things that I was saying that is kind of surprising is that there's been a general theme in literature about loneliness for about 15 or 20 years now, saying that as baby boomers age out and become the largest segment of the population as seniors, that's where the primary area of loneliness would be. And we actually find out, because of the Signal report and some other work that's been done, that it's exactly the opposite. Generation Z, which are the people born between 1997 and 2012, are the loneliest age group. 65% say they are sometimes or always lonely. And 87% say it's difficult to make friends because they're shy. Millennials are the second most lonely group. So 65% of them also say that they often or sometimes feel lonely. And 60% say it's difficult to make friends because they're shy. Then when you jump ahead to Gen X, the group born between 1961 and 1980, they're the third most likely to feel lonely. And 50% or sometimes or always feel lonely. And that issue of shyness doesn't even really come to the top in their reporting. And then finally, strangely enough, baby boomers and people from the older generation are the least likely to feel lonely. 44% of baby boomers say that they sometimes or always feel lonely. Now, as I said, this kind of goes against what we would have thought was a logical conclusion. You know, there's tons of work out there talking about how as people age, we begin to experience losses. You know, we lose friends, we lose loved ones, we lose positions as people retire or lose their employment. So they lose that group of people around them. They lose their sense of a place in society. So all of that is, you know, a very logical contribution to feelings of loneliness. So why are they least likely to feel lonely?
Patrick, if I could just, this is Daniela, if I could just interrupt you for a brief moment. Several folks are saying that they're having some difficulty hearing you. If you could move a little closer to your computer speaker, that would help us out greatly.
Absolutely. Is this better?
Thank you. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. So one of the things that has come out in some of the more recent research is that loneliness is a subjective thing, and it differs from culture to culture and from people to people. Cultural norms affect the way that we feel loneliness, the degree, and the timing in our lifespan of when we experience loneliness. Levels of loneliness really change as you go from culture to culture. Some cultures rely much more heavily on family and community ties to define their quality of life. And then some cultures, for instance, the United States, where people, it's a rather individualistic society and we tend to rely on ourselves. Some of the research shows that cultures that focus strongly on interpersonal connections creates a larger expectation of being connected socially. And so people, when they do feel lonely, they're more inclined to feel that the culture is the reason for this. They feel a sense of rejection. And we have the flip side when we talk about individualistic societies. In individualistic societies where people feel that they're in charge of their own life and they're the most person in charge, we're way more likely to actually blame ourselves when we feel lonely. And so you might look at those two things, that a pluralistic society, people tend to feel that society is rejecting them. And then we say that people blame themselves in an individualistic society. We might think that the first one was the more important one. But it's actually easier for people to reconnect to society in a collective than it is in an individualistic society. And this is because it requires more effort on the part of the individual to begin to reach out. And when you've grown up in a society that tells you that you're supposed to stand on your own, that you're responsible for success or failure in your own life, that you're responsible solely or primarily for the quality of your life, then you're far more reluctant to reach out when you need help, when you're feeling that sense of loneliness. And so we find that people in those types of society tend to isolate more when they feel lonely. And so then it becomes self-perpetuating. So people in American society, which we consider basically to be an individualistic type of society, think of loneliness as a personal problem. So this is something that I should be able to figure out and solve for myself. But loneliness has serious effects on society through all kinds of other parts of it, other aspects of loneliness. So it's not just a personal problem, it's a social problem. We have increased healthcare costs. A recent survey that was done in the last 5 years showed that the lack of social connections and loneliness can predict vulnerability to all types of disease and early mortality through traditional risk factors such as increased smoking, higher blood pressure, lack of physical activity. Vivek Murthy, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is a former Surgeon General, has recently come out with a book called Together, The Healing Power of Human Connections in a Sometimes Lonely World. And Vivek talks a lot about the effects of loneliness on healthcare. And what we see is that dramatically increased healthcare costs for people who are isolated and feel lonely. We also see increases in things that we would expect more likely, things like anxiety and depression, but also antisocial behavior and even suicidality. And then we see something that has really brought this to the forefront and created this need for more research. And that is loneliness creates a loss of productivity in our economy. A few years ago, and we'll talk about it in more depth in a few minutes, but a few years ago in the United Kingdom, they began to really notice some changes that were taking place in the productivity of their economy and productivity of individuals in the economy. And they began to look for the reasons why these things were changing, and they zeroed in partially on the breakdown of social connections. Loneliness is a public health problem. And so therefore, a lot of the factors that are driving it are not just problems of I'm a shy person, I grew up feeling that I'm totally responsible for my own success or failure or making friends or not. A lot of the things that are driving this tendency towards increased loneliness are societal issues. And societal issues are gigantic. I mean, we look at what's going on in society right now. We look at some of the things that are happening simultaneously in our society right now. We've already got really an epidemic of loneliness. We put on top of that a pandemic, which creates fear on multiple levels. We see people afraid of infection, afraid of infection for their loved ones or people they care for. We see people afraid of losing their job and economic insecurity. At the same time, we see this beginning of rebirth of a very strong and powerful social movement for civil rights and equality in our society, which is a hugely positive action, but at the same time, it creates another area of instability. And then we start to see we've got a major election coming up. Society has really huge choices to make about the directions it's going to go. You put all of that together, and we are a society in a constant state of flux. And that's a very difficult thing to work with. So one of the theories that you hear a lot, and I've seen it in a lot of popular articles written in magazines over the last couple of years, is that one of the reasons loneliness is larger now is because of more time that people spend on social media and less time in front of people. And that sounds very logical, because people spend more of their time playing games, surfing the internet, on phones, constantly abstracted from what's going around them. If you've seen some of the videos, people walking down a crowded street, constantly looking at their phone, constantly answering messages, and running into a telephone pole. I mean, that's how engaged we get in this new media that's become available to us just in the last few decades. We feel that this logically would take away from the bonds that we could be creating with real people around us, that we tend to ignore the people around us and concentrate on those rather abstract connections to people. There's a saying in social media or about social media that social media invites us to compare and despair. In other words, we're always comparing ourselves to some unattainable goal. There's always something better or newer or higher or worth more money than the situation we're in. So we're constantly comparing ourselves. And we're comparing ourselves not just to our neighborhood or our workplace or the people that we know in our social circles. We're now comparing ourselves worldwide. But surprisingly, the Cigna report and some work done by the government shows that social media is not the only factor. In fact, it's not the most important factor. Personal interactions, both physical and mental wellness and life balance, are more likely to predict loneliness than social media usage. So there's actually almost no difference when you compare the degree of loneliness between people who use a lot of social media. They're constantly on their phone, they're IMing their friends late at night, or sending out photos or videos, or watching the latest things that have come up. There's very little difference really in loneliness between heavy media users, social media users, and people who never use it, which is really quite surprising, because as I said, more popular media has constantly said this is it. There's been huge articles out that kids are lost in gaming. They have no real idea of the real world around them. But the reality is that when people have the opportunity to intermix with people around them, and then they don't do it, that has a bigger effect on their feeling of loneliness. So that the kid who goes to school and is rejected by a social group that they wish to be a part of, that kid, that child is going to grow up into be an older person who continues to carry those scars with them and continues to have a tendency towards separation. And the reason for that is, we learn very early that if we're unsuccessful in forming bonds in our early years, in our childhood, that we no longer want to put ourselves out there. We don't want to risk our feelings of self-esteem, which are probably already damaged. We don't want to risk the sense of rejection that we might feel. And so consequently, we don't try. And that's where the biggest drop-off in loneliness is we have not yet figured out how to instill in younger people this idea that they can have more, that what happens in childhood is not the sole predictor of what your life is going to be like. And think about this, because again, if we look at the examples in behavioral health, and we look at the idea of people who have been institutionalized, had multiple hospitalizations, or been secluded because of symptomology or family ideas about what it means to have mental health problems. All of those things that isolates people due to behavioral health issues. You talk to those people. You talk to someone when they're coming out of a long-term hospitalization, and you ask them what are their goals. And generally their goals are fairly simple, very narrow. It's like to stay out of the hospital, to stay out of jail, to stay on my medications. And that's about as broadly as they can see. And so one of the incredible roles of peer support really is to show people that that horizon can be immense. It can be whatever we want it to be, that we have the capacity to have so much more in our lives. Just because we were hospitalized, just because we have a diagnosis, just because some people choose to use that as a way of separating us socially, doesn't mean that we give up on life. And this is where peer support has been so immensely successful. And we'll get a little more into that a little later too. But it really is, if you work in peer support, I think that's probably the most rewarding part of our job, is when you're talking to somebody whose life, whose views, whose horizons have gotten so narrow that they have tunnel vision, and you begin to talk to them about possibilities, and you begin to talk to them about strengths, and you see that aha moment where a person realized that they can actually have a life that they want. Nothing feels better than that, I think, as a peer support worker. In 2009, there was a study done by the University of Chicago and UC San Diego and Harvard that found that people are 50% more likely to be lonely if someone they associate with is lonely. That sounds kind of weird because you've got a friend or somebody you associate with, so where does the loneliness come in? Lonely people are less likely to pick up on social cues about attention and commitment from other people. So in a conversation, someone may be reaching out to you, they may be opening up to you, but lonely people are so insecure frequently that they don't hear that invitation to engage, and so they withdraw prematurely. And then the person they're talking to, the people that they associate with, read that as rejection. And that makes them feel less likely to reach out to other people. And so it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Loneliness can drive people to move away from interpersonal connections. It can sometimes drive people to connections online, which in turn may actually exacerbate their overall loneliness, like we were talking about earlier. But what it does, the reason why it may drive them to that type of relationship is because rejection is not so direct. When you feel rejected face to face, there's a greater impact on you, and then it influences your future behavior even more. So it's really strange, when we're lonely, we don't read social cues very well because we're so defensive and we're so relatively sure that people are going to reject us, that even when they're trying to accept us and trying to open up to us because they're wanting that connection also, both sides end up driving the other away. And so this is, like I say, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Some of the other factors, loneliness in the workplace is really on the uptick. 32% of men and 23% of women feel abandoned by coworkers when they're under pressure. I was talking to my son. I have a son who lives with a diagnosis and has gone through many of the same experiences I've gone through my life, hospitalizations, feelings of exclusion and loneliness on our own part. And I was talking to him, and he has recently gone back to work, which is a huge thing in his life. It's just so important. He had 5 years where he had to drop out of his work cycle and went through all of those things that many of us have experienced. Anyway, he is feeling this thing that when his coworkers don't respond to him right away, he tends to feel abandoned by them. And so this is where you start off from a feeling of insecurity, which drives loneliness, and then you go into a situation where you're put in proximity to other people in a work environment, at least before this pandemic, where people can actually see each other face to face. Some people are more likely to feel abandoned when coworkers don't have time or are not available to help them when they're under pressure. 35% of all people feel a general sense of emptiness at work. We all would like to think that we can find the work that we love in our life, that we will find meaning in work and in relationships. But for some of us, work is a stepping stone to move to another place in your life. It's also a way to continue to exist. It's self-preservation. 39% of people feel like they have to hide themselves, their true self at work. They can't be who they are. And think about that. I think almost anybody's felt that when they've started a new job. We're all like, okay, I can't let them know that I feel worried about being able to do this, or that this is the pressure is getting to me. We all put on a face for a while, but when it goes on year after year and there's no relief from it, that creates another driving force for loneliness. Lonely workers say that they're less engaged in their work, they're less productive, they have lower retention rates, they tend to stay at jobs for shorter periods of time. And this is again driven by a feeling of loneliness because they can't connect. What does this mean for us now as we move forward? And we talk a lot about what is going to be our new normal coming through this pandemic. And right now we've got so many people who are now working remotely. We've increased that remote workforce just exponentially over the last 6 months, 7 months. What is that going to mean for people as we move forward? There is a tendency among people to join together, and to work together, and to feel some kind of support in working in teams or knowing that somebody has your back. When we first started talking about recovery in the 1990s, because we didn't always use that word recovery in behavioral health or in mental health, and we first started having those conversations, I was working with a peer-run organization in Florida, and we joined with some other peer-run organizations around the country, and we sent out these surveys. And one of the questions on the survey was, what do you most credit as being the most important factor in your personal recovery or journey towards recovery? And the number one answer 3 years in a row was having at least one person who believes in me, at least one person who has my back, at least one friend. And in all the programs that I've worked in over the years that are social inclusion programs, trying to help people develop friendships, trying to help them feel like a part of the community they live in, that's always been the number one factor, having a friend. 54% of remote workers, and this is again prior to our current situation, feel that their relationships with others are not meaningful, their relationships in work. 45% of people who work in an office environment feel that way. So it's already a high percentage, but now when we start saying, well, you're going to work from home for the next 6 months, year, 2 years, this is going to be ongoing, what's going to happen to the way we find ways to relate to each other? There's going to have to be new ways to do this. And many of us are looking at this now and trying to figure it out. And we're trying to figure it out both from a behavioral health point of view, but behavioral health is just a microcosm of society at large. These problems exist throughout society. 57% of remote workers say that they always or sometimes feel lonely. And 52 of office workers who work together in an office setting feel that same way. So it's already a high percentage. So the Cigna report goes on to say that people who feel that they work just the right amount are the ones who are least likely to feel lonely in their workplace. They feel like they work just the right amount. They've got a good balance between work and personal life. Conversely, people who feel that they work either too much or too little are more likely to feel lonely. Now, it's kind of odd. You could see perhaps, you know, if you just looked at it from the surface, you could say, well, people who don't work enough and feel like they're not engaged enough in other things outside of their personal circle could feel more lonely. But why do people who work too much? Because work has become more isolating in its very nature. You know, when computers and all of the tools that have come with the advent of computers to become a commonplace in the workplace, when all of that came in, we thought these are going to be great, you know, aids to better and more effective work. Well, what they've done is they've increased our workload. And so consequently, some people feel just constantly like their workload is just increasing all the time, and they have no time for anything else in their life. So people who work too much feel lonely, people who work too little feel lonely. And those of us who feel like we work the right amount, just the right amount, we're less likely to feel lonely. Workplaces and other environments that have the opportunity to reach people, so classes, schools, colleges, all of those places where people come together in some way or another, and that's evolving how we come together. But where we do come together, that's the place where we can begin to address these things that are driving us apart. And we can figure out, how do we use the workplace to bring people back together? A lot of things have happened in workplaces. Like, for instance, perhaps when I was growing up, you know, as a child, I found my friends at school or in my neighborhood. Perhaps my family found their friends through the workplace, through religious organizations. As I got older, I found almost all of my friends through the workplace. And I had less connections in the communities, perhaps in my parents' generation. But then the nature of the workplace began to change, and we found that people, you know, it began to be frowned upon to, as they say, fraternize with your coworkers, particularly when it comes to romantic relationships or any kind of interpersonal type relationship. There's a potential for an inequality or a power imbalance in any work environment. And we know that that can be really detrimental to people feeling safe in the workplace, feeling that they're not taken advantage of, that they're not being harassed. But at the same time, when those rules have to get that strict, we've shut down a major way where people could form meaningful relationships. And so consequently, we see people seeking out relationships, you know, anonymously online, trying to find people that might have similar interests or other things that attract them to each other. People meeting each other in anonymous environments like bars or parties. And those things are all part of our lives, but, you know, not necessarily perhaps the healthiest way to do this. So again, we are a society in flux, and loneliness is a big part of that flux. It's one of the ramifications of a society that's not found its firm footing on how it's going to continue to develop. As remote workers become more prevalent, you know, as I said earlier, we've got to find new ways for people to connect. You know, and there's been some really interesting things that have come out of all this remote work. You know, workplaces having lunches together where everybody, my office, for instance, they sent out food to all of us So we could all sit in front of our computer and have our food together and have one of our regular supposed lunches, you know, where we just chatted back and forth. We do that on a regular basis, and I must admit it's nice. And some places have like a happy hour at the end of work, virtually, online. So we're finding ways to do this, but there's a long way to go. Loneliness in the UK, they've been looking at it more deeply, longer than we have. In 2018, Prime Minister May appointed an actual Minister of Loneliness in the United Kingdom. Name was Tracy Crouch. The new Prime Minister has not filled that seat, so who knows if that will continue. But the work they started did. The Prime Minister said that loneliness is one of the greatest public health challenges of our time. And so she launched a huge cross-governmental effort to try to find ways to address it. General practitioners will be able to refer patients to community activities and voluntary services. So GPs under the National Health Services, which is kind of, you know, our version of Medicare for all that they have in the United Kingdom, they now are able to actually prescribe connections to community activities and voluntary services. It's known as social prescribing. High-profile businesses have gotten into the act and have pledged to support employees' health and social well-being. And the government, I thought this was very interesting, they partnered with the Royal Mail Service in targeted cities so that they had postal workers begin to check up on lonely people that they provided service to on their delivery rounds. And then they would help to link them to support from their families and communities to groups and activities in the community. So they started very actively taking a social, looking for social solutions to the loneliness problem. The National Health Service is part of a long-term plan funding connecting to people. So they've done these things like they've created walking clubs and cooking classes and art groups under National Health. And it's because it actually is about health. And it's just a new way of looking at keeping people healthy. Because if you think back to what I said earlier on and what our former Surgeon General said, loneliness contributes to ill health and early mortality, increases smoking, increases blood pressure, increases all kinds of negative health consequences. So it makes perfect sense that then a health service would begin prescribing social activities to overcome loneliness. They even included in their funding, as part of their program, converting underutilized spaces into new community cafes and art spaces and gardens. The Prime Minister made some additional commitments. They incorporated loneliness into policy decisions across the board, addressing loneliness in relationship education classes for children in their school system. So they started talking about loneliness at the very beginning when kids need it most to understand what it means to be lonely and what it means to reject someone or be rejected. Pilot programs to support flexible volunteering for people with long-term health conditions. So this actually goes both ways. They have volunteers coming in to work with people with long-term health conditions, but they've also created this whole system where people who live with long-term health conditions can work in volunteer roles, which gives their life more meaning, and they find that their health outcomes increase. They've worked with tech companies to address the impact of technology on loneliness. In 2018, the Minister of Loneliness, Tracy Crouch, stated, "Our strategy sets out a powerful vision for addressing this generational challenge." And that's exactly what it is. It has, in the last few generations, it has continued to just grow and grow and grow. And that's why we see actually that the degree of loneliness comes from the youngest to the oldest. By bringing together mental health services, businesses, local authorities, charities, community groups. We in our society can raise awareness too of loneliness and help people build connections that lead to happier and healthier lives. So that's what they've been doing in the United Kingdom. So what are we doing? So much of this work, by the way, has been done by a group called the Joe Cox Foundation. And Joe Cox was a member of Parliament who started this focus on loneliness in 2016, 2015. In 2016, during the Brexit campaigns, she was murdered on the street by an individual who was a member of ultra-conservative groups, had connections to US-based neo-Nazi groups. Following her death, because it was such, ahead of its time thinking that she was doing, and they created this loneliness commission, and after Joe's death, they renamed it the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness, and they issued in 2018 a real seminal report that has helped the government to begin these initiatives. And this is the type of initiative we need in this country. We need to begin to take this just as seriously and try and find out how we tie all aspects of society, business, education, faith-based, governmental, everything together to address this epidemic, really pandemic of loneliness. So, as we were talking about, Americans pride themselves on individualism. And this can get in the way when people try to overcome loneliness and they feel like, they have to do it themselves. We need to move people to a thought or a feeling of we do for each other and we accept when others do for us. This is a little bit harder when you feel like, you rely on yourself, and if you don't, it speaks poorly of you. The UK sometimes seems to have a kind of a more of all for one and one for all attitude, but I really don't think we're that different. Western culture has strong ties to both points of view. And if we look, for instance, at faith-based organization in this country, we see that there's almost always that idea of the group helping the few or the group helping the individual. And in those certain kinds of circumstances, it's easier for us to accept help. And so we just need to kind of find a way to make that a broader way of accepting help, and then a broader way of offering help. This type of working together, this kind of acceptance of the need to help and the desire to help others is the way that we're going to come up with social solutions to this real world pandemic of loneliness. The United States isn't the most lonely culture, but it is lonelier in general statistically than, for instance, the United Kingdom that saw the problem sooner than we did, but it's less lonely than some other countries. If we look back really deeply, the root cause of loneliness is actually in our evolution. Modern society is not at all like the way mankind developed, which was group-based, community-based. Humans are really deeply social animals, and as a whole, we're not really good or well adapted to survive loneliness and isolation. That doesn't mean all people. Some people enjoy solitude. Some people enjoy being on their own. They don't feel that need for social connection. But as a species, we do. Even as adults, we are so dependent on our groups that for millennia, when cultures would exile a person or would shun them, where they acted like they didn't exist anymore, that was like a sentence of death to people. We evolved to experience social rejection in the same way we experience physical pain. Some brain scans that have been done during some research that was done in the early 2000s have shown that social pain, loneliness, such as being shunned or rejected by your group, activates the same part of the brain as bodily trauma. Tragically, it also activates these hyper alert states where the body is looking for danger around it because we are experiencing loneliness the same way we experience trauma or bodily trauma. So we go into this kind of hyper alert, looking for danger, and it forces us to misinterpret social cues, which then in fact, makes our loneliness even worse because we misread people's intentions. We see things perhaps as threatening when they're not. Talked about this a little bit earlier. So we're far less able to see things from the perspectives of others. So then when we reject somebody because we're afraid of rejection ourselves, that person then feels rejected. And as we talked about, it's just this ongoing chain of rejection and loneliness. Peer support, psychosocial interventions that include peer support have had really positive effects in dealing with stigma and also in helping people feel a part of a whole. Peer support really, our goal is to encourage people to think positively about their future and recovery. And as a group, we do this for each other. We help each other to move into those areas. As I said, people, they credited most important thing in their recovery was having at least one person who believed in them. The personal stories that we use, our personal stories as peer specialists that we use are really helpful for other people to overcome stigma and to see the possibility of connections to the broader world around them. So as I said before, that story that your life can be far greater, that idea that you are not what other people say about you. And the proof is in meeting other people who've gone through similar experiences and been able to survive and thrive. And that's part of the power of peer support. Mental Health America has a program called It's My Life Peer Partners, which has been a support group program that's peer driven, and it helps people using psychiatric rehabilitation, peer support, and a self-directed care model to address loneliness and isolation and the need for connection to community. Because it is a support group and it's been a face-to-face model, we've not been able to continue the groups over the last few months. And so we've started to make some new changes to it. And we have a new program called I'm Not Alone that's based on this. This program, It's My Life, has been running for 6 years now, extremely successful, very high outcomes of people feeling connected, feeling like they've made friendships, achieving their social goals within a specified amount of time. And we've been able to grow this into 8 states. But as I said before, because it's a live support group, we've had to kind of put it to the side right now. So in August, we're going to launch I'm Not Alone. And this is going to be an online program that does a similar things. The basis of It's My Life and I'm Not Alone is people can meet other people through shared interests. And in the live program, we would help people find things to identify things that they like to do and then find opportunities to do them. And by doing that, they would then meet other people who like to do similar things. And so this program will do essentially that. It will put people in opportunities of online experiences and then the ability to break into smaller groups, to break into individual relationships, to contribute to the overall program, and really feel a part of something larger than themselves and meet people who like to do similar things. And then I just want to bring up very quickly the Temple University Collaborative on Community Inclusion has done a huge amount of work on coming up with programs to help people integrate into their communities, feel a part of the community around them as opposed to being excluded or pushed to the edges of it. And they've created a huge amount of toolkits and papers and research on this area. And they've done quite a bit on peer-run programs. The collaborative lists over a dozen programs and tools for peer specialists. And so they're Peer Facilitated Community Inclusion Toolkit is available for download, and I'm sure this will be available to you later, but you can find it through Temple University Community Collaborative, or Collaborative for Community Inclusion, and you'll be able to download this and many other tools. And really, these are wonderful peer-driven, peer conceptualized programs that help people feel part of something greater than themselves, and thereby really to fight against loneliness and to feel connection. So peer support can be a huge tool in ending social exclusion and loneliness. And it's something that's got to be confronted. We've got to confront it now, both in our field of behavioral health, but also society-wide, because it's growing in its negative aspects, and now we are going through some profound social changes, and we don't know what that new normal will be. And so this is something that we need to begin to work on immediately. So with that, I think we are ready to take some questions. And this is my contact information, should you wish.
That's great. Thanks so much, Patrick. We've got lots of questions that came in. And the first is actually, I'm just going to go working backwards because there's a question that just popped up about Temple, and you just talked about Temple University. So is that a collaborative on community inclusion a free resource, or is that something that folks need to pay for?
It's free. It's completely free, and it's really a rich website. Some of the materials are older, some are newer. You can go through them and see what works for you, but it's a very rich resource.
Awesome. So let's go back to sort of the beginning of your presentation. A bunch of folks were asking about social media and how that affects loneliness in younger generations, and we're wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, like I said, one of the things people first think of when they think of loneliness is that the use of social media and this kind of a societal obsession we have with online involvement is one of the driving causes of loneliness, but it really is only a part of it. It's more about how we learn to socialize as children. And if we experience rejection as children, if we're not taught the skills for building one-to-one relationships, that's going to cause way more trouble moving forward in terms of overcoming loneliness than being involved in social media. There's the one statistic that said that heavy users of social media have very little difference in their loneliness amount compared to people who don't use social media at all.
That's interesting. And somebody else actually just on the heels of this commented, what about folks who are in prison or incarcerated? Are there any studies about this population in relation to loneliness that you know about?
It's very interesting to me because in January, I was just starting a program with we were just getting ready to start a program with the Colorado Division of Corrections. And part of what we were going to be doing inside the prisons, we were going to be training peer specialists, but a lot of it was going to be on building healthy and strong social relationships so that when people then come out of prison, some of them can actually go back in and continue to work as in a bridger type role like NIAPRIS does. But I don't think there's been a whole lot published on it. I'm sure there's some people out doing it. I haven't found a lot published. I was so unhappy that we've had to curtail that program because we can't get into the prisons right now.
Right. Good point. Question about Dr. Murthy. So as you were speaking about his book and his research, folks were actually in the chat box chatting about that same topic. So like great minds think alike. Would you be able to just give us the name of his book one more time, please?
Sure. It's Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World.
Great. Thank you.
And it just came out.
And yep, he's actually on his book tour right now, I hear.
Bad time for a book tour.
I know, right? Well, I guess maybe it's a virtual bookstore. Who knows?
Yeah.
So lots of folks I just wanted to share, there was a lot of comments about thanking you for bringing culture into the topic. That's something that I think we're all sort of looking for these days and looking for more of. So we appreciated that. And people would just wanted to say thank you. So I wanted to share that. A little bit about workplace and developing, some socialization in the workplace. Why do you think camaraderie is so hard to develop or is lacking in some people's workplaces?
It's the way our workplace has evolved. I mean, we are seeing some exceptions to it. And I think out of the tech industry, originally they started to build in some social aspects, but it's become so highly competitive that those social opportunities get pushed to the side. Work in general in the United States has increased, the workload. The work week has not. In fact, in some places it's decreased, the official work week. But people find that they're working more and more and more to do what they think is the minimum for their job. It's, I think as we've become more competitive and people have, the values of our society in general have gone towards, we are judged by our success in the workplace, financially, and social position. And when you put those things together, it creates a competition that does not allow for really open relationships. Now, interestingly enough to me, like I said, while we've all been moving towards this remote work, or many of us have had to move towards remote work because we can't go into the office right now, we've actually created some new social opportunities for everybody to kind of hang out together that maybe exceeds what they had when they actually worked in the office together. But I do think the workplace is the number one place where we have the opportunity to meet new people, and we need to find better ways to adapt the work environment to let that happen without sacrificing the quality of the work we do. And I think that's totally possible. It just takes a new way of looking at things.
And so a follow-up question to that is about what employers can do to help their employees be more successful in making connections and improving feelings of loneliness.
Well, bigger corporations have led the way recently in creating opportunities for social engagement in corporations, and not just the office party kind of thing that has always been around, but actually creating events that employees can participate in. Where I work, which is obviously a mental health organization, so hopefully we tend to be a little healthier in those aspects, but we do a lot of opportunities where the staff can get together and totally non-work involved and participate in activities. And I think we need to do this because we're replacing all those things that have kind of gone by the wayside. I mean, faith-based is less involved in our lives these days, and neighborhoods tend to be a smaller factor in our lives now because social mobility and mobility in general have increased. People move far more frequently than they did before, so very few people grow up and develop in the same place. So the workplace is the place where we have this chance, and I think that organizations have to really begin to concentrate on this. In this vein, Mental Health America has started providing excellence in the workplace awards to companies around the United States that are doing a really good job at providing mentally healthy work environments and where people have the chance to grow and to form relationships. And consequently, those corporations that have participated with us in this have said that their work performances have actually gone up.
Thank you for that. So we've got a couple more questions. Do you have any recommendations for people with PTSD or social anxiety to feel more safe or comfortable reaching out to each other? Or reaching out to others, sorry, especially during this time, this pandemic?
I do, and I do because I speak from personal experience. You know, I mentioned earlier on in the thing that some of us feel more comfortable in the beginning, at least, in trying to be around other people who have had similar experiences to us. And because there's a safety there, the safety being that it tends to be non-judgmental. Um, Anybody who's experienced severe trauma in their life, one of the driving needs in order to form any kind of relationships is a feeling of safety. And so you have to figure out what that means to you. What is safe to you? And it may mean only in small groups. It may be that in the beginning, you only want to talk to people who you can closely identify with. In other words, maybe had similar experiences or something that you can equate to it. But it's a slow process. It does build. Um, Most of us can find our way to a feeling of safety and then find a way to expand beyond that. And then hopefully we have an opportunity in our life to give back to the other people who are experiencing in that more early time.
So this question actually just popped in as you were speaking and answering the other question, but as a person with a disability, I often experience loneliness and isolation in my work and community. I want to be a part of what's going on, but people don't always want me around. So this person says they've seen this with other peer work for PWDs as well, and her community or their community is very Republican in a Democratic state. Socializing is difficult enough, and the pandemic makes it worse. So maybe you could speak a little bit to, is there a difference or is there an increase or not of loneliness among, you know, a peer workforce who might feel more isolated from the rest of the organization they work in?
Definitely. And this is, you know, whenever an organization begins to think seriously about bringing peer support into their array of services, they have to look at it from the point of view of the individual has got to feel some degree of support, but they can't be, you know, left out there on their own. It's a terrible idea for an organization to bring one or even just two people in. Two people is not unusual. At least you have somebody else that you can talk to when you first come in, because when you're the first ones coming in representing peer support workforce, you not only feel alone and different from everybody else in the clinical world, but you also feel this unnecessary, or should be unnecessary, idea that you represent peer workforce and what you do is going to judge the whole peer workforce. One of the ways around this, when you work in a place that doesn't have that built-in kind of support, is to seek out support in the greater community around you. And hopefully there's more than one agency or organization in that community that also employs peer workforce. And if you can begin to come together, maybe weekly or every other week, have a meeting, support group for peer specialists is an excellent idea. There's been some online ones. I know DBSA used to do one. I know that there's some going on now. DBSA, I don't believe does theirs anymore. I thought they were going to start it. But anyway, there are some online tools for support. But you know, the face-to-face support groups is just the best idea. And it's not only just so that you can have somebody you can identify with, it also allows you to do a better job at your work because you can bounce ideas off each other. It's hard to sit down with you know, somebody in a clinical role and you're approaching something from the idea of peer support and I'm there to support this person in achieving their own personal goals, and I'm trying to think of new ways to approach that. You know, the clinical ideas are going to most likely be very different. So an opportunity to be around other people who are doing what you do is really terrific. And if you're in a place where you can't have that face-to-face, go online, look for some support groups that look like they will meet your needs. And there's so many choices now. It may be other peer specialists, or it may be just people who are seeking support for a variety of reasons. But luckily, those assets are growing right now.
And so we just got something in the chat box from Rosemary. Thank you for sharing that, for supportgroupcentral.com. And I've also heard of that one. That one is a good resource for lots of different types of groups. Yeah. So we have about half a minute left, and people are curious to know about what underneath your MHA logo, the B4 stage 4 means, and they want to get some more information around MHA and you, and we were hoping you could just give a, quick minute or
just quickly on before, Mental Health America was originally the National Mental Health Association, and we were founded in 1909. So we're a long-term organization with over 200 affiliates. But that B4 stage 4 is that we feel that mental health in particular is the only major health problem that has traditionally only been addressed when people fall into the deep end of services, that we wait until people are really desperate to get help. And that's just wrong. We should start building mental health when kids are first going into school systems. It's not about services all the time. It's about showing people that they can have mentally healthy lives, they can create good relationships, they can learn to be healthy people, and they can meet other people that are like-minded. So it's not really comparing it to cancer, which I think some people read before stage 4. It just means, why wait until people have to be hospitalized or have to end up on heavy medications or something? Why don't we deal with mental health from an early age?
Great, thank you. Harvey, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out, if you don't mind.
Patrick, that was just so passionate and so full of information. I don't like to say this a lot to people, but you are a good man. And you bring that heart and that kindness and this lifetime of commitment. I know you, and I know how many areas you work in, but this was a beautiful presentation. Again, not only because of all the facts and information, but because of who you are and how you present it and all the answers you gave. So, we just want to really thank you for doing this. I know a lot of people were on, a lot of people are grateful. We're going to hear a lot more about it. We're probably going to have to bring you back soon, Patrick. So don't go far.
Anytime, okay. Harvey. And I enjoy thoroughly working with you on anything. So thank you.
God bless. God bless.
Take care.
Bye-bye.